I didn't even know my husband was dead. I found out 2 days later from the newspaper. No phone call. No text. No one told me anything. They had the funeral without me. I just sat there in my quiet little house, holding the paper like it was someone else's life I was reading about. But it was mine. They thought I didn't matter, that I was too old, that I had nothing left to say. They forgot one thing. I had the only copy of his will. It's still in my dresser drawer, sealed, signed, hidden from everyone. And once they find out what's inside, well, let's just say they buried the wrong person. If you've ever felt like your own family tried to erase you, this story is for you. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you believe in standing up for yourself even when no one stands with you. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time is it right now. You'd be surprised how many others are watching this same story along with you, because sometimes being forgotten is the biggest mistake they can make. The phone rang at 9:42 a.m. She almost didn't answer. These days, it was either a scam or a wrong number. But something told her to pick up Margaret. The voice said, soft and unsure. It was Judy, her neighbor from across the street, the one who still brought pies during holidays and waved from her porch. I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry about John, Judy continued. I thought maybe you'd be at the church already. Margaret's hand tightened around the phone. Church? The funeral, honey, Judy said. They're doing the live stream right now, didn't they? Didn't anyone tell you? The room tilted slightly. Margaret pressed her hand to the kitchen counter to steady herself. No, she said. No one told me anything. Oh my God, Judy whispered. I thought maybe it was private, or you were traveling, or I just assumed it's fine, Margaret said quickly, before the crack in her voice gave her away. Thanks for letting me know. She hung up. Didn't cry. Just walked to her old laptop, opened it, and typed in the church's name. The live stream was already halfway through. The camera was shaky, focused on flowers and pews and black suits. There at the front was his photo. Her John, smiling like he always did in that old blue shirt. Her children sat in the front row. Her son James wore the watch his father had left him last Christmas. Her daughter-in-law Claire had sunglasses on inside the church. They looked polished, composed, comfortable. Not one seat was left for her. She turned up the volume. The pastor was speaking about love, family, and memory. He mentioned John's strong marriage. The wife he cherished. She wondered if he even knew she wasn't there. Margaret stared at the screen like she was watching strangers say goodbye to a man they barely knew. Her throat tightened. But no tears came. Not yet. After the live stream ended, she sat still for a long time. The screen faded to black. Her reflection looked back at her holder, lonelier and a little colder than it had been an hour ago. Later that night, she called James straight to voicemail. She texted, I saw the funeral online. Why wasn't I told? The reply came hours later. We thought it would be too hard on you. Mom, Claire said it might be better this way. Margaret stared at the message. Not angry. Not even shocked. Just numb. Better this way. Like she was a burden. Like grief was a thing you had to protect her from. As if she hadn't buried her own parents. Held her husband's hand through chemo. Managed a household on one salary for 20 years. They used love as a shield for their cruelty. And now they had buried her husband without her. The man who once told her, you'll be the last face I see. And she hadn't even been in the room. She opened the drawer beside her bed. There it was, the will, still sealed. John had given it to her the day before his last hospital trip. Keep this safe, he had said, his voice hoarse. Don't let anyone touch it. Not even the kids. Especially not them. At the time, she thought he was just tired rambling, but now it felt like prophecy. She hadn't read it yet. Not all of it. But she knew one thing. It was the only real version. The others were copies or drafts. Or maybe worse. Margaret held the envelope to her chest and closed her eyes. They thought she wouldn't come to the funeral. They were right. But she was about to show up for everything else. Something in her shifted. Something quiet. A kind of strength that doesn't scream or threaten, just rises, slowly, like water warming to a boil. They'd tried to erase her, but she was still here, and they had no idea what she was holding. The front door creaked open, just like it always had. The house still smelled faintly of lemon polish and lavender, a scent Margaret had used since the early years of their marriage. But the silence now felt heavier, not peaceful, but hollow. She stepped inside slowly, as if the walls might remember her. 40 years. That's how long this house had known her laughter, her anger, her tired footsteps after work, and the quiet hums she used to sing while folding laundry. She closed the door behind her and stood there, letting the silence speak. The photos on the wall hadn't changed. Their wedding portrait still hung above the hallway, mirror he in a cheap tux, she with flowers pinned in her hair. Neither of them had much back then, but they'd had each other, and back then that was enough. The kids used to say this house was too small, too plain, that it smelled old. They stopped visiting as often after John got sick. It started with missed birthdays, then holidays, then full months. They called sometimes, mostly when they needed something. She didn't blame them. Not fully. Life pulls people in different directions. But now, standing in the home she once fought to keep during layoffs and medical bills, Margaret realized they had left long before the funeral. She walked into the living room. The recliner still had the imprint of his body. His old mug sat on the shelf. Number 1, Dad? Ah, and chipped blue paint. She reached for the photo frame on the fireplace mantel. It was one of their last pictures together, taken during his second hospital stay. He looked thinner, but his eyes still sparkled when he smiled at her as she wiped dust from the glass. The back panel of the frame shifted. Something slipped behind it. She turned it over, and there it was, a folded letter. Her name was written on the front in John's unmistakable handwriting. Even near the end, when his hands trembled, he wrote with care. She sat down slowly on the couch, heart pounding harder than it should for a woman her age. It wasn't fear. It was that strange mix of grief and curiosity, of knowing something waited behind the paper that could change everything or nothing. She opened it. If you're reading this, then they've already made their move. Her eyes froze on that sentence. I've seen the way James talks to you, the way Claire treats you like a guest in your own family. I didn't say much. Maybe I should have. But I was scared. Scared of rocking the boat. Scared of losing what little time I had. Margaret's fingers trembled. You gave me dignity when I couldn't walk. You shaved my face when I couldn't hold the razor. And you never once complained. That's why I'm leaving everything to you. You earned it. You built it. And you stayed. There are other versions of the will drafts, scanned copies, but only yours is signed, notarized, and final. Keep it safe. You're stronger than they know, and I'm still with you, even now, love. J. The letter fell into her lap. She leaned back on the couch, eyes wide but dry. She thought the funeral was the final blow. That being excluded meant she was truly alone. But here he was, still protecting her. Even in death, all the years of quiet sacrifice. He saw them. All the things she did without praise or applause. He remembered. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't paranoid. They had been planning something. And John had known. Margaret folded the letter back up and tucked it into her sweater pocket. She looked around the room again, not with sadness, but with sharpened eyes. Everything had changed. But not everything was lost. There was a storm coming. And this time, she wouldn't be sitting on the sidelines. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like it was holding something. Something secret. Something powerful. Margaret sat at the kitchen table. The letter from John opened beside her. The paper had begun to crease from how many times she'd unfolded and folded it again. She could almost hear his voice between the lines, calm, tired, but firm. He'd known, not just suspected. He had known what the children were planning. She opened the drawer again, carefully pulling out the envelope he had given her before his last hospital stay. It had sat there for weeks, untouched. Grief had fogged her memory. But now, everything came into focus. The seal cracked open like a long-held breath. Inside was a thick set of documents, the final version of his will, dated, signed, notarized. Witnessed, her name was everywhere, not just as a beneficiary. As the executor, she read every word slowly, making sure she wasn't imagining it. There were no vague instructions, no shared responsibilities. This wasn't a placeholder. This was final, legally binding, clear. Under no condition shall my wife Margaret be removed from decisions regarding the estate, finances, or end-of-life arrangements. Any versions of this will that do not include her as sole executor are invalid. Her hands trembled, not from fear this time, but something deeper, the feeling of being seen, defended. Remembered, she exhaled slowly. The children had presented a digital copy to the church and the bank, one that excluded her. One Claire had likely pushed through. Probably printed at home. Probably conveniently edited. Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up the scanned will James had emailed weeks ago. She hadn't even looked at it back then. The differences were obvious. Her name was moved far down the page. Listed only as a secondary contact in the event of dispute. James and Claire were listed as joint executors in their version. She was a footnote. In his version, she was everything. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. They hadn't just cut her out emotionally. They'd tried to erase her from their father's legacy. But John had seen it coming, and he had written her back in. Word by word. Margaret leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. It wasn't about money. She didn't need their house or their charity. It was about truth. She had been with John when he was nothing, when he couldn't pay the mortgage, when his back gave out and he spent months in pain. She cooked, cleaned, managed the bills, raised their children, and sat by his bedside when he took his last breath. Where were they then? Claire had barely visited during his illness, always too busy. James stopped calling except to ask for account numbers and passwords. They didn't care about the man. They only cared about what he'd left behind. And now they'd buried him like... She was already dead. Margaret stood up. Slowly, her body hurt. Her heart ached. But her mind? Her mind had never been clearer. She gathered the documents and placed them in a zippered leather folder. Then she went to the closet and pulled out her old handbag, the one she hadn't used since last Christmas. Inside was her tiny black address book. She flipped it open and smiled. Richard E. Langston, attorney at law, a friend. Her husband's oldest legal contact, trusted private. She dialed the number. Langston Law. Hi, she said. Is Richard in? The voice paused. He's just stepping out. Can I take a... Tell him it's Margaret, John's wife. A beat. Hold, please. Moments later, the familiar deep voice came through the line. Margaret. I have the will, she said. The real one. A pause. Come in. Tomorrow? Early. We'll go over it together. No one else can know, she added. They won't hear a word from me. She hung up and exhaled. It was beginning, not a fight. Not a war, just the truth returning to the surface. Margaret went back into the living room and picked up the frame from the mantel, the one with the hospital photo. She stared into John's eyes. Even sick, even tired, he had loved her enough to prepare for. This to trust her with everything. I won't let them win, she whispered. She kissed her finger and pressed it to the glass. The house around her seemed to exhale too, as if it had been holding the secret just as long. She opened the curtains, let the light in, and began to pack her things. Tomorrow, she'd walk into that lawyer's office, not as a grieving widow, but as a woman holding the one thing no one saw coming, the truth. The dining room table was set for 8 white plates, silver cutlery, candles flickering like it was someone's birthday, not a morning dinner. Margaret sat at the far end, next to the window. The chair felt unfamiliar, even though it was in her own son's home. She adjusted her sweater, suddenly aware of how small her presence felt in the room. James stood at the head of the table, wineglass in hand. Claire hovered beside him, smiling like a hostess at a charity event. Their 2 kids were on their phones, half engaged, half bored. A few extended relatives filled the other seats, people who hadn't seen John in years, now sipping wine in his honor, or what they called his honor. To Dad, James said, lifting his glass. A man who worked hard, lived well, and left us all something to remember him by. Laughter. Soft clinks of glasses. Someone made a joke about John's legendary thriftiness, and Claire followed up with, "Not so thrifty by the end, thank God." Margaret blinked. They hadn't even waited a week. Claire leaned in toward a cousin. "We're thinking about opening up the estate, just updating the kitchen, maybe knocking down a few walls. It's got good bones, but Mom's taste is a little dated." Margaret said nothing. She watched Claire swirl her wine and talk about liquidating assets. Like it was a spreadsheet, not a life. The house where she raised 2 children, where she planted roses every spring, where John had built their bedroom shelves by hand, nail by nail. Honestly, Claire added, Mom wouldn't want the stress. She needs rest. Close your dot, double quotes, close your dot. The word felt like a slap. Margaret looked down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap. Her wedding ring caught the light, thinner now, a little worn, still there. James tapped his glass again. "We're going to schedule the estate meeting next week. The lawyers got our version of the will, and once probate's done, we'll finally get things moving. Vacation house in Florida." Someone joked, "Don't tempt me." Claire laughed. Margaret looked around the room. Not one person had asked how she was doing. Not one had looked her in the eye. They were already talking like she was gone, not just from the house, but from the story. Like she had no place here, but she did. More than anyone at that table, she had built what they were dividing. Every checkbook balance, every scratched floorboard, every picture frame hanging crooked on the walls. Her hands had shaped it all, and now they sat here carving it up like vultures around a meal that hadn't finished cooking. Her rage didn't scream, it simmered. She raised her water glass slowly, interrupting Claire mid-sentence. "To John," Margaret said, voice quiet but sharp. The table paused. "He always said a family shows who they want, are after the funeral." There was a moment of stillness. Then someone coughed. James smiled nervously. Claire tightened her jaw. Margaret took a sip of water and put the glass down gently. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Let them laugh. Let them plan. Let them keep thinking the will in their hands was final, because the one that mattered was in her bag, and it said something very different. The building hadn't changed in 20 years. Same brick exterior. Same hand-painted wooden sign that read Langston and Bell. Attorneys at law. Margaret stepped through the front door, clutching the leather folder against her chest. Her heels tapped softly on the polished wood floor. She'd worn her best coat, navy blue wool with silver buttons. John always said it made her look like a senator's wife. The receptionist glanced up and smiled gently. "Mrs. Hargrove?" Margaret nodded. "He's expecting you." Right through that door. She knocked once before pushing it open. Richard Langston stood from behind a heavy oak desk. He looked older, gray hair thinned out, lines deeper around the eyes, but his presence hadn't faded. He walked around the desk and offered both hands. "Margaret," he said, "I was so sorry to hear about John." She gave a tight smile. "He trusted you. That's why I'm here." She placed the folder on the desk. Carefully, she opened it and slid the papers across to him. Langston took a seat, adjusting his glasses as he read. The room went still. Pages turned. Pens scratched. His brow furrowed finally. He looked up. "Where did you get this?" "John gave it to me the day before he was admitted. Said not to let anyone else touch it." Langston nodded slowly. "This is the real will. Signed, notarized, witnessed. No question." He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a thick file. "This," he said, lifting another stack of papers, "is what your son submitted." He handed it to her. Margaret scanned the pages. It looked official. Legal fonts, letterhead. But something was missing. "There's no signature," she said quietly. Langston nodded. "Draft only." It wasn't final, not binding. Margaret closed the folder gently. He knew, she said. He knew they'd try something. Langston leaned back in his chair. Your husband may have been quiet, but he wasn't blind. He protected you. He pulled a new sheet of paper from a drawer, then looked Margaret in the eye. If you're ready, we can start the process to execute the actual will. It'll override the draft, but it won't be subtle. I don't want subtle, she said. He waited. She folded her hands in her lap. They buried their father, she said, and tried to bury me with him. Her voice was calm. Steel beneath silk. But I'm not done. Langston nodded once. Then let's begin. He stamped the first document. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a gavel. They never expected a knock on their door. Claire opened it mid-lunch, still in her robe. A man in a dark suit handed her a sealed envelope and said, "Only you've been served." An hour later, James stood pacing in the kitchen, face red, hands clenched. The papers trembling between his fingers. "This is insane," he barked. "She's trying to steal from us." Claire leaned over the counter, reading the documents a second time. "It's real. This is signed, witnessed. Final." James shook his head. No, she can't do this. Dad showed me the draft. It had my name. We're the executors." Claire's voice turned cold. "Drafts don't count, James. You know that." His jaw locked. "She's manipulating it, twisting it." Then came the second envelope. This time, hand-delivered to both of them, an invitation, a family meeting, mandatory, legal, all parties present. The next evening, Margaret stood at the front of Claire and James's living room. Her bag on the table, papers already laid out. The children sat in stiff silence. James looked like he hadn't slept. Claire's smile was plastic. Lips pressed too tightly. The grandchildren weren't invited. This wasn't for them. No snacks, no pleasantries, just truth. Margaret opened the folder and pulled out the original will. She handed a copy to each of them without saying a word. James scanned the front page and scoffed. So what? He changed his mind. "No," she said. This was his final decision. Dated, signed, witnessed. Yours was a draft. This one was his. Claire cut in, voice sharp. "You forged this." Or pressured him. He wasn't thinking clearly. Margaret reached into her bag again. This time she handed them the letter. His handwriting. His words. The room fell quiet. James read it once. Then again, his face changed. "I don't believe this," he whispered. "This can't be real." Claire stood up. "Even if it is real, this is disgusting. Coming after your own children." Margaret met her eyes. "You buried your father and made plans before the ground was even settled. You celebrated your inheritance while I sat alone in the house we built together." James slammed the folder shut. "This is revenge. That's what this is." Margaret didn't flinch. "You had the funeral without me," she said softly. "You told people I was too fragile, that I didn't need to be involved." James's voice cracked. "We didn't think you could handle it." She tilted her head. "You didn't think I mattered?" He sat back. Stunned, Claire folded her arms. "So what now? You want to cut us out?" "I'm not cutting anyone," Margaret replied. "Your father already made that decision. I'm just honoring it." James looked at the letter one more time. Something in his face softened, just barely. "I didn't know," he said. Claire shot him a glare. "Don't start that." But he didn't argue. He looked at his mother and whispered, "I thought you were done." Margaret nodded. "So did I, until he reminded me who I was." Silence, the loud kind. The heavy kind, no yelling, no shouting. Just the sound of consequences landing. Claire stood abruptly. "I don't need to listen to this." She stormed out, the door slamming behind her. James stayed seated. For once he looked young, not in years but in spirit. Like a boy who had just been told the truth after a long, well-believed lie. Margaret gathered her papers calmly. She didn't scold. She didn't cry. She let the silence speak for her. And in that silence, a verdict was clear. She wasn't invisible anymore. She didn't know who leaked it, maybe a clerk at the courthouse. Maybe someone from Claire's side, hoping to embarrass her. But 3 days after the confrontation, her phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. "You're on the front page of the Ledger." Margaret opened the link slowly. Her hands trembled, just a little, not from fear, but disbelief. Widow fights for her late husband's true last wishes. After being left out of funeral, the headline sat above a picture of her from a church picnic 5 years ago. She looked tired in the photos, sun in her eyes, hands on her hips, but her gaze was steady. The article told the story. How a woman was excluded from her husband's funeral. How a newer, unsigned draft of his will had been used to cut her out. How she quietly presented the original signed, sealed. And final. The reporter had called her calm, graceful, and unshakable. Margaret didn't remember speaking to any reporter, but the story was out by noon. Her voicemail was full. Some were angry strangers who thought she was airing family business in public. But most were kind. "Thank you. My daughter tried to take everything after my husband died. They told me I wasn't needed anymore. I thought I was alone. You stood up, and now I think I can too." Some letters came handwritten. One with a single line: "I watched my mother disappear in silence. You gave her a voice." She sat on the porch that evening with a warm mug of tea and a stack of envelopes. The breeze was soft. Her garden was blooming late that year, but the flowers seemed brighter. Her neighbor, Linda, walked by on her evening walk. "You really did it," Linda said, stopping at the fence. "You stood up to them." Margaret smiled. "I just did what John asked me to." Linda leaned on the gate. "Well, you did it for more than him." Margaret tilted her head. "Women around here are talking," Linda said. "At the market, in church. Some of us were pushed out of our own homes when our husbands passed. Told we were too old or that we wouldn't understand the paperwork. But you reminded them that we still have a say." Margaret looked down at her hands, weathered, veined. Strong. She hadn't meant to start anything, but maybe something had started. Later that night, the local radio mentioned the story. A short segment, but it ended with a simple quote. "They forgot she built the house. She just reminded them who still holds the key." She smiled, alone in the quiet. The key wasn't metal. It wasn't legal. It was voice. And she had found hers again. The ruling came on a Thursday morning. It was quiet in the courtroom, no gasps, no theatrics. Just the sound of the judge's voice, steady and clear. The court recognizes the final. Signed will submitted by Mrs. Margaret Hargrove as the legal and binding testament of the deceased. The words echoed like thunder in Margaret's chest. It was done. The house, the land, the business shares, the accounts, every piece they had built together, every chipped brick, every fruit tree planted in spring, it was all hers again. Not because she fought dirty, but because she didn't back down. Claire didn't show up for the ruling. James sat, stone-faced in the back row, arms crossed. He didn't look at her when she passed. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked if she had anything to say. Margaret paused, then answered calmly, "I didn't win. I just stood up." She didn't go back to the big house that day. She drove past it slowly. Windows rolled down. The roses in the front still bloomed, but the place no longer felt like home. She didn't need to reclaim the walls. She had reclaimed herself instead. She drove to the bank, opened a trust fund in her granddaughter's name for school, for life, for whatever she dreamed. The girl had visited often, even when others didn't. She listened. She asked about Grandpa. She helped trim the rose bushes. Margaret wrote the first check from the estate to a local hospice organization, the same one that had cared for John during his final days. They had been kind, patient, gentle in ways that couldn't be taught in textbooks. It wasn't about charity. It was about honoring. That night, she sat by her bedroom window in the small rental cottage she had chosen for herself. A place with quiet walls and morning light. She opened the drawer of her nightstand and took out the small velvet box. Inside sat her wedding ring. She turned it over in her hand, letting the weight of it settle into her palm. For decades, that ring had been part of her, not just a symbol of love, but of identity. wife, partner, builder of home and memory. But now she was something else, not less, not lonely, just changed. She placed the ring inside the box and closed it gently. Love didn't disappear just because the world's changed. It simply found quieter rooms to live in. In the weeks that followed, she declined interviews, declined offers to tell her side, on talk shows or in magazine spreads. She didn't need to explain herself. The papers said she'd won, but she didn't feel like a winner. She felt like someone who had crossed a long burning bridge and finally stood on solid ground. And from that ground she would plant again. She walked her granddaughter through the land one afternoon, pointing out where the fig tree had once stood, and where John had almost broken his leg digging trenches for the irrigation line. "This is yours now," she said softly. "When you're ready." The girl looked at her, eyes wide. "But what about you?" Margaret smiled. "I've had my season. Now it's yours." The girl hugged her tightly, and for the first time in months, Margaret let herself cry. Not from loss, but from release. Later that evening, she wrote a new letter. Not a legal one. Not a will, just a letter. If you're reading this, I hope you know what it means to stay standing when the world sits you down. I hope you remember that silence is not surrender. And I hope you know the difference between what's given to you and what you've earned. She folded it, sealed it, and placed it inside the velvet box beside the ring. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer led the story. The fire cracked gently in the hearth, painting soft golden light across the walls of her new living room. It was a smaller space than the house she once shared with John, cozier, quieter, the kind of place where nothing echoed and every sound belonged. Margaret sat in her favorite chair, a hand-knit blanket folded across her lap, a fresh journal resting on the side table. The pages were crisp, untouched, waiting for her handwriting to give them meaning. A photo of her and John sat nearby, not in a grand frame or a shrine, just propped casually beside a lamp, like a memory that needed no ceremony to feel real. She looked at it for a long time, then began to speak. "They left me out of the funeral," she said softly, her voice steady, not bitter, "because they thought I had no place. That without him, I disappeared too." She paused, letting the words settle. But grief is an absence, and love doesn't need permission. She picked up the pen beside the journal, a smooth, heavy one she had bought for herself. A little luxury. A small statement. Her new will would not be typed, notarized in a rush, or left in someone else's drawer. It would be written in her own hand, with her own ink, and stored in a place only she controlled. She began writing, "To those I love, and those who stayed, this is not just a record of things I own. This is a record of things I chose." She wrote slowly, deliberately. Each name added came with a memory. Her granddaughter's laughter, the neighbor who brought soup after court, the hospice nurse who sang hymns under her breath. And each omission was just as intentional, not as punishment, but as truth. There was no room left for people who only loved her when it was convenient. She reached the end of the page. "No one speaks for me but me." She closed the journal, tied the ribbon, slid it into a small locked drawer under the stairs, a new drawer with a new lock, and a new key that never left her chain. Outside, dusk settled over the Georgia trees. The wind shifted through the leaves, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting for anyone to knock or call or apologize. Her story had moved on, and so had she. She stood slowly, joints creaking but strong. She walked to the window and looked out over the garden she had begun planting just weeks earlier. The rose bushes were still small, but they would grow. Everything took time. She remembered the early years with John, how broke they'd been, how fiercely they had worked to turn a rented apartment into a home. She remembered the winters when they couldn't afford both heat and groceries, how they chose blankets and potatoes and smiled anyway. No one saw those moments when they read a will, but she remembered, and she made sure someone else would. Remembered, too, her granddaughter had asked her once, "How do you stay kind when people aren't kind to you?" Margaret had answered with a half smile, You stop being kind to stay liked. And you start being kind because you like who you are. She stepped away from the window and sat at the small piano by the wall. It hadn't been tuned in years, and her fingers weren't as quick, but the first few notes of the old hymn came back to her. Nearer, my God, to thee. John had hated that song, said it always made him feel like someone had died. She laughed quietly to herself. Maybe that's why she played it now, not because someone had died, but because someone else had finally come back to life. Her later that evening. She lit a single candle, made herself tea, and sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh envelope. She wrote, to my granddaughter, this house, this story, this strength, it's all yours someday. But don't wait to inherit your power. Take it now. Speak now. And don't ever let anyone tell you that your silence makes their actions okay. You come from women who kept going. Remember that? She sealed the letter, marked the envelope with her granddaughter's name, tucked it behind the photo frame on the mantel. One last note. One last seed. She didn't need applause, or revenge, or recognition. She just needed peace, and she had it now, as the fire dimmed into soft embers. Margaret whispered to herself, not just a widow, not just forgotten, not just a name they almost erased. She smiled. The keeper of my own story. And for the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel like a chapter. She felt like the author.